Okay, for our next section of notes, we're going to do it a little bit differently. We basically covered all parts of chapter 27 with the first unit for this class. For this unit, we're going to cover a portion of chapters 28, 29, and all of chapter 30. So to me, it's kind of all one thing, and so we're going to cover it all at once. And so this first section of notes with it is around chapters 28 and 29. So we're going to look at moral and dollar diplomacy. And then with chapter 30, we're going to look at the lead up to World War I. So taking a look at, I guess, specifically dollar diplomacy with this first section. The readings this week had you look at the beginning of the presidency of William Howard Taft, who took office after Theodore Roosevelt. So this section is titled Taft, a round peg in a square hole. And so Taft is actually kind of handpicked as a successor to Theodore Roosevelt because Roosevelt has served his 2 terms, and so Taft moves in and takes over. And so at first he is popular and inspires confidence because of that connection to Roosevelt. He'd been trusted administrator for the Roosevelt administration when he worked in the Philippines. We have already talked about Taft. He was the governor of the Philippines who reported back to the United States after the Spanish-American War and the Filipino insurrection. He worked in the Roosevelt administration in the U.S. And then also had a role in Cuba. He also had a strong record as a lawyer and judge. And this ties into kind of more 10th grade American history stuff, but towards labor unions and trust and stuff, he was seen as hostile. Not super important for the HOA content, but just to maybe connect to what you learned last year. But his weaknesses soon became very apparent. Roosevelt had led a Republican Party that was somewhat split, and things that I think kind of can connect well to today. There was a portion of the party that was more conservative and another portion that was more progressive. And Roosevelt was able to balance those two and kind of push them forward just simply using the strength of his personality. Taft did not have those same leadership skills. He wasn't willing to fight or speak up necessarily for every cause. He was much more passive when he dealt with Congress and just politics in general. So whereas Roosevelt's very aggressive, Taft is much more passive. He also makes a habit of frequently saying things that are not correct. So what we call foot and mouth disease, where he would say something and then immediately have to backtrack on it. And specifically, he's much too conservative to make the progressive portion of his party happy. So he's elected president in 1908. We will talk about the election of 1912 because Roosevelt becomes unhappy with his hand-picked successor. And again, you might remember some of this from 10th grade. And so that was actually the end of the first section, just talking about Taft and kind of not his unfitness in the presidency. And so now we're going to look at his diplomacy. And so we looked at Roosevelt and big stick diplomacy. Over the next several slides, we are going to look at Taft and what becomes known as his dollar diplomacy. So Taft's plan for foreign policy replaced big stick policy with dollar diplomacy. And this slide here does a really good job of kind of summarizing what dollar diplomacy is. And so the idea is that U.S. investors are going to pour money into areas of strategic concern for the United States, specifically the Far East, thinking China, and then Latin America around the just built and opened Panama Canal. It opens in 1914, I believe. And so the idea here is businesses that have extra funds, extra money, and are looking for things to do with it, go spend that money overseas and increase the United States' influence overseas. And so then this would block investors from other foreign countries from getting involved, which would bring profit back to those countries in the United States, and then the government itself would have an increased amount of influence. So we mentioned the Far East, and so here is dollar diplomacy and work, and attempting to be at work in Manchuria. Russia and Japan controlled railroads in northern China in the Manchuria region, and Taft doesn't like this because he's afraid that the two countries could work around the open door policy that was established about 10 years earlier, and then prevent trade between China and US merchants, which would do several things. One, it would obviously hurt our economy, and two, it would hurt our standing on the world stage because we would basically be blocked out of this region. And so Taft's his Secretary of State, Knox, proposes that a group of US and foreign bankers buy up these railroads. So go and purchase these railroads from Japan and Russia and then sell them back to China. And the idea here is that China will then have sovereignty over this area, and because the United States assisted them in getting that, they will be more kind to US trade in the region than Japan and Russia appear to be. Japan and Russia, however, have no incentive to do this. It would be making them money on the sale of the railroad, but the investments of the railroad would disappear. And so Taft and Knox are kind of ridiculed on the world stage, basically like, why would we do this? And then dollar diplomacy in Latin America, which is where we will talk about it more than any other place. Because of the Monroe Doctrine, the United States had refused to allow European investment in Latin America, and not just the Monroe Doctrine, but the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine prevented that. And so to prevent political and economic instability in these countries, Taft urged US investors to invest in Latin America to keep foreign funds out and maintain political and economic stability in the region. Now, what becomes a problem is what happens when we pump money into these places and there is political turmoil, and what the United States feels the need to do. And so to protect these investments, we're often sending in US forces to put down disturbances and revolutions. And you've got a couple of examples, or you've got an example and then a generalization with the next two bullet points. So in 1912, the US are forced to send in 2,500 Marines in Nicaragua to put down a revolution. So that is a commitment of our military, not just to suppress the revolution, but in order to keep stability, they end up staying for 13 years. And then as that last bullet point says, a US intervention was also needed to protect American investment at various times in Cuba, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic. The map on the next page, and I believe it is also in your textbook on page, sorry, I'm turning pages here. Yes, on page 686 also displays this. These are the United States' actions during this early 1900 time period where we intervene militarily, and then where and then how long we do so. And so you can see several examples of that. So let's just take Cuba as an example, because we've talked about Cuba. So from 1898 to 1902, US troops are in Cuba. That's obviously around the Spanish-American War and then the stability afterwards. But then we come back in 1906 to 1909. So that is during Roosevelt's term as presidency. But we're back yet again from 1917 to 1922, which is during Woodrow Wilson's presidency. And so we see this kind of repeated involvement in these places because we have a vested interest. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want you to maybe pause the video here and look at how much involvement the United States has in Latin America. And while supposedly with big stick diplomacy, it means we're using the military, and dollar diplomacy meant dollars, during Taft's presidency, 1908 to 1912, we are spending troops and using troops in Latin America a great deal. So anyway, that's a good map. It shows a lot of this idea of the different diplomacies in action and ultimately what they resulted in. So that is it with the notes.